Many Russian historians were engaged in studying and describing the history of Russia, such as Tatishev, Lomonosov, Karamzin, Kluchevsky, Kostomarov, Solovyov, and Zabelin. Foreigners also wrote extensively about Russian history, for example, Mueller and Schlotzer. Each of them had their own attitude towards Russia and its history, and each gave their own assessment of the Russian state and its rulers. Therefore, reading and comparing the works of these authors, one understands that everything they wrote cannot be considered the true history of Russia. These are only different historical versions proposed by different historians. And ultimately, our knowledge and understanding of Russian history depend on which authors we read.
Specifically, which authors we are taught to read from childhood.
After all, in every country, every nation has a so-called official history. Russia has one too. In this film, we will talk about who wrote Russian history and when.
The creation of the version of Russian history that is widely known today began in the early 17th century after the ascension of the first Romanovs.
In 1672, in Moscow, the Great State Book or Root of the Russian Sovereigns, also known as the Book of Titles, was compiled in the ambassadorial prikaz, which was Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time. And in 1674, the first official edition of the new version of Russian history was published, called Synopsis. However, it was only in the 18th century that the creation of an official version of Russian history became a matter of state importance and was put on academic footing.
It is commonly believed that Vasily Nikitich Tatishev was the first Russian historian, a prominent statesman of the first half of the 18th century.
He managed state-owned factories in the Urals, then was the governor of Astrakhan for several years, and was involved in geography and economics. For 20 years, Tatishev collected ancient Russian historical documents. Based on them, he wrote the history of the Russian state and intended to publish it in 1740. However, it turned out to be impossible to publish this unique work in Russia. Then Tatishev tried to publish his work in England, but this attempt also failed. What was the reason? It turns out that in 1719 Tatishev read Nestor's Chronicle. This was a copy of the Radziwill Chronicle, which Peter the Great brought from Königsberg 4 years earlier. Tatishev made a copy of this manuscript for himself, and some time later, he found another copy of Nestor's Chronicle with a schismatic in Siberia. To his surprise, he discovered that it was a completely different document. It turned out that there was more than one Nestor's Chronicles. Gradually, Tatishev collected a dozen such manuscripts. Based on them, he compiled his work and brought it from Astrakhan to St. Petersburg to show to various knowledgeable people who, as he believed, might approve and endorse it. But instead of support, Tatishev was accused of free thinking and heresy. As a result, Tatishev's many years of work did not see the light during his lifetime and was eventually lost. What is now called Tatishev's history is just his diaries, published a few years after the scientist's death under the editorship of Gerhard Mueller, a Russian historian of German origin and one of the founders of traditional Russian history. In his preface to the first volume, Mueller openly wrote that he corrected Tatishev's text. In the original, there are sometimes mistakes in the proper names of foreign writers, peoples and cities. I was entrusted with correcting the aforementioned places, and I took this upon myself all the more willingly than it seemed to me necessary, especially when it came to those chapters that were translated from ancient Greek and Latin writers. To what extent Mueller thoroughly edited Tatishev's texts, even his contemporaries could not determine, since no authentic drafts or other manuscripts of Tatishev's history were seen by anyone. Moreover, this edition by Mueller for some reason did not include the first part of Tatishev's work, which describes the history of Russia before Rurik. Thus, calling Tatishev the founder of Russian historiography can be quite conditional.
And surprisingly, foreign historians are the true authors of official Russian history.
For the past 300 years, few in Russia and Europe have talked about the fact that the 18th century was a period of fierce struggle by Russian society for the right to have its own domestic science. It is difficult to imagine now, but at that time, the very existence of Russian science was under question. No European nation was denied this right, and only Russians had to prove it in a struggle not only with European scientists, but also with their own government. In the 1730s, during the reign of Empress Anna Ivanovna, Russia was simply flooded with foreigners, including those from the scientific class. At that time, out of 89 members of the Russian Academy of Sciences, only 17 were Russians. The poet Vyazemsky, a well-known wit in his time, called the Academy the German Quarter.
Foreign professors and academics had complete control in the Petersburg Academy of Sciences and in the academic gymnasium, which trained future students.
The teaching process seemed to be deliberately designed in such a way that no truly educated person would graduate from the gymnasium. How could gymnasium students learn anything if teaching was conducted not in their native Russian language but exclusively in Latin and German? And all because the teachers, imported from Germany, did not know Russian and did not want to learn it, while the gymnasium students did not know German. Over a period of 30 years, from 1726 to 1755, the gymnasium did not prepare a single person for admission to the academy. However, the leaders of the gymnasium did not blame themselves or their educational system, but rather Russian students. They claimed that Russians were simply incapable of learning sciences and that it was impossible to prepare them for admission to the academy.
The way out for Russian science was to invite specialists and students from Europe, which they did for a long time.
It is not surprising, therefore, that the founders of the so-called scientific version of Russian history were foreign scientists, namely Germans. The first to lay the foundations of this version was Gottlieb Siegfried Baer. Baer was one of the first academics of the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. In 1725, he was invited to Russia by the president of the Academy, Blumentrost. Baer headed the Department of Eastern Antiquities and Languages. For 12 years, Baer lived in Russia, studying Eastern culture and working on the creation of Russian history. It is difficult to understand how he did this, as he did not read ancient Russian chronicles. In his 12 years in Russia, he never learned Russian. As the historian Kluchevsky wrote, Baer simply did not want to learn it. So the man whom historians still worship as one of the pillars of Russian historical science could not speak or read Russian. Therefore, Baer studied the early history of Russia from foreign sources, such as Greek, Latin, German, and Scandinavian. It is not surprising that it was Baer who first proposed the so-called Norman theory of the origin of the Russian state. It was this academic who first declared that the Slavs were a wild, barbaric people, incapable of building their own state. And that, supposedly, it was only thanks to Varangian princes that Russians finally emerged from the darkness of ignorance. The fact that Baer knew very little about Russian historical documents is evident, for example, from the fact that he did not know that the first published version of Russian history, Synopsis, was not a chronicle, but a history textbook. Perhaps he did not need to know this, just as he did not need to read Russian chronicles. Foreign historians in Russia had a different task: to write a version of Russian history that the Romanovs ordered. And Gottlieb Baer succeeded in this task. He wrote a treatise on the Varangians, which later became the basis of the so-called Norman theory of the origin of Russia. The successor to Baer became Gerhard Friedrich Mueller, also a German. He also came to Russia in 1725, also at the invitation of Blumentrost. At that time, Mueller was only 20 years old, so he became not an academician like Baer, but initially only an academic student of the newly established St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences, and taught at the gymnasium that opened at the academy. In 1731, at the age of 25, with the support of the Academy's Chancery Secretary, the German Schumacher, Mueller had already become a professor, despite the absence of independent research and the agreement of the academicians. After some time, he realized that his only way to success in Russia was to engage in Russian historiography, which was supported by academician Baer. To enable Mueller to participate in the development of Russian historical sources, Baer advised him to start learning Russian immediately, which Baer himself never did. From 1733 to 1743, Mueller worked on expeditions in Kamchatka and Siberia, where he searched for ancient documents. He started studying the Siberian archives from Tabals, and then searched through archives in many other cities. He hired scribes to copy the documents that interested him, and brought all these copies with him to St. Petersburg. This collection of documents, more than 30 volumes, became known as Mueller's portfolios. It is unknown according to what principle Mueller selected the documents for copying and what happened to the originals. It is also unknown which of these texts are actually copies, and which were edited or written by Mueller himself. In 1747, Mueller resumed his relationship with the Academy and was officially appointed as a historian after becoming a Russian subject. Interestingly, before starting to work on processing ancient documents, he had to sign, in modern terms, a non-disclosure agreement regarding state secrets. In 1749, a significant event for Russian historical science happened.
Mueller prepared a speech that he planned to deliver at a solemn meeting of the Academy.
The speech was titled, "Origin of the Russian People and Their Name." In it, Mueller developed the idea, which he considered justified, about the Scandinavian origin of the Russian state, proposed by Baer. The speech caused outrage among the academics. Mikhail Lomonosov called the speech a nightmarish one. He wondered why the author missed the best opportunity to praise the Russian people. Not only Lomonosov, but also Krasheninnikov, Popov, and other academics accused Mueller of not showing any case in the whole speech that could glorify the Russian people, but only mentioning what could serve to their dishonor, namely, how they were repeatedly defeated in battles, and that they were devastated by robbery, fire, and sword, and their czars were robbed of their treasures. As a result, the speech was deemed detrimental to Russia. A decision was made to seize and destroy it. And it seemed that this academic conflict was resolved smoothly for Russian science. But after 18 years, Mueller's speech was still published in Sweden. And after another 100 years, it firmly established itself in textbooks. The Norman theory of the origin of the Russian state became the official doctrine of the Romanov dynasty. In 1766, thanks to Prince Golitsyn, Mueller became the head of the Moscow archive of the Collegium of Foreign Affairs. This was not just a bureaucratic position. Mueller was allowed access to an enormous archive that was extremely important for Russian history. Diplomatic correspondence of the Moscow government from the end of the 15th century was stored here.
The documents were preserved in remarkable completeness.
In this atmosphere, Mueller felt at home. He began a systematic description of the archive. But the former academic did not come to this position to compile inventories.
He began to process the material found there.
Moreover, he wanted to write a new Russian history, starting from the time of false Dmitry I. After the scandalous speech on the origin of the Russian people and their name, Lomonosov kept a close eye on Mueller for a long time. He was very afraid of his work. His attacks on Mueller were not caused by personal antipathy. Lomonosov was a patriot, and in each of Mueller's works, he saw spitefulness and prejudiced speeches about the Russian people. Lomonosov said that Mueller only noticed the stains on the Russian body's clothes, not its ornaments. And yet, it is quite obvious that the results of Mueller's activity suited the Romanovs perfectly. Catherine the Great especially favored Mueller. She bought his handwritten library from him for the fantastic sum of 20,000 rubles, which was a huge amount of money for those times. In 1761, August Ludwig Schlotzer was employed by Gerhard Mueller as a servant. Schlotzer never aimed to live in Russia. His dream was the Orient, Egypt, and Palestine. But such journeys required money, which he did not have. At the recommendation of one of his university teachers, Schlotzer found a job in Russia. It was a position as a teacher in Mueller's house. Gradually, Mueller began to attract Schlotzer to work with his archive of manuscripts. Schlotzer quickly realized that Russian historiography was an area that could give him both quick fame and good money. He began to study Church Slavonic language. After some time, Schlotzer became an adjunct. He wanted to establish himself in the Academy of Sciences, so he presented two of his plans for consideration by the academics: a plan for the development of Russian history and a plan for familiarization with the history of Russian society. In other words, the creation of an official historical version and its subsequent propaganda.
Schlotzer believed that to develop Russian history, all major sources, especially chronicles and foreign reports about Russia, must be subjected to preliminary critical processing.
That is, Russian history had to be what Schlotzer would compose. Lomonosov, having read this plan, became extremely irritated. When the German academics approved it, Lomonosov presented a note expressing his opinion in a very sharp form.
According to Lomonosov, the opinion of foreign professors on this subject means nothing because, as foreigners, they themselves have no idea about the matter.
Schlotzer needs to learn a lot more to be a professor of Russian history. And, finally, there is simply no place for him in the academy. But Schlotzer thought differently. He believed that he was capable of not only writing a textbook on the history of Russia.
Schlotzer began compiling Russian grammar, with a very original interpretation of Russian words.
For example, in his opinion, the word boyar was derived from the word baran, ram, and the Russian word knyaz, prince, from the German word knecht, which means servant. Even Mueller stated that Schlotzer should not be allowed to access Russian documents or to study Russian history at all. But Schlotzer asked for permission to work on the development of Russian history from Catherine the Great herself and under her patronage. He received her consent along with the position of academician. He presented his works for approval personally to Catherine. Moreover, Schlotzer was granted access to all libraries and archives. Lomonosov wrote about this bitterly. There is nothing left to protect. Everything is open to the madman Schlotzer. And all Russian historians of the 19th century, from Karamzin to Solovyov, looked at this man as the first teacher, the founder of Russian history, and followed his methods. The natural question arises, where were the Russian scholars? Why did the work on the development of Russian history end up in the hands of foreigners? In what other European countries did foreigners describe local history? Certainly, in Russia there were scientists who opposed this. And the most ardent defender of Russian history was Mikhail Vasilyevich Lomonosov. In February 1742, Mikhail Vasilyevich Lomonosov supported the complaint that teachers and officials of the Academy of Sciences filed with the Senate against the secretary and treasurer of the Academy, Schumacher, and his son-in-law, the Academy's librarian Taubert. Although at this time Lomonosov had just received the title of adjunct, which finally gave him the right to independent scientific work and participation in academic meetings, he could not remain aloof from the struggle of his colleagues. The complaint stated that no Russian person had been promoted to professor since the founding of the Academy, and even teaching Russian youths had ceased. Since the opening of the Academy, the understanding of its purpose had changed. Originally, the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences was created to train Russian scientists. However, as a result, the Russian Academy began to educate foreign students who could later flee to their homelands. In other words, without establishing the production of its own scientists, Russia began to produce them for foreign countries, and at its own expense. Therefore, it did not matter to Russia whether such an academy existed or not. The complainants demanded that the Academy of Sciences be transformed into a Russian institution not only in name. To consider this complaint, the Senate created a commission, which included people who had no knowledge of the affairs of the Academy and had no understanding of them. After allegedly thorough investigation, the Senate Commission declared that the statements made by the Academy employees were just an uprising of the common people against their superiors. As a result, the Senate Commission made a monstrous decision. Schumacher and Taubert were recognized as the injured party, and it was decided to reward them.
On the contrary, Russian scientists who dared to speak out against foreign domination in Russian science were punished. Some of them were put in chains and shackles.
They remained in this position for about 2 years but never recanted their testimony. The complainants were found guilty by Empress Elizabeth Petrovna but were exempted from punishment.
However, all of them were dismissed from the Academy.
And certainly, foreign academicians did not miss the opportunity to deal away with Lomonosov. For his participation in the rebellion, the Senate Commission demanded the death penalty for him, or at the very least, corporal punishment and deprivation of rights and property. Lomonosov spent 7 months under house arrest awaiting the highest decision. The Empress did not support the Commission's demands, and Lomonosov was released from punishment. However, at the same time, his salary was halved, and he had to apologize to the foreign professors for his insolence. Lomonosov's main opponent, Mueller, composed a mocking repentance that Lomonosov publicly recited and signed. This was the first and last time that Lomonosov was forced to abandon his views. Until the end of his life, Lomonosov devoted a lot of time to studying Russian history. History was as important to him as natural sciences. Therefore, he sharply criticized Mueller's dissertation on the origin of the name and people of Russia. He gave a devastating critique of Bayer's works on Russian history. This is what Lomonosov wrote about Bear. It seems to me that he is much like some kind of idolatrous priest who, having smoked himself with white incense and stupefied with it, and spinning around on one leg, twists his head and gives incomprehensible and completely wild answers. Despite the strong opposition from foreign academicians, Lomonosov consistently fought for Russian science.
Thanks to him, several Russian academicians and adjuncts still appeared in the Russian Academy of Sciences.
But Mueller, naturally, did not give up. He succeeded in removing Lomonosov from the leadership of the geographical department and took his place. Moreover, even during Lomonosov's lifetime, Mueller tried to obtain the highest order to transfer all of Lomonosov's materials on the Russian language and history to his disposal. But Mueller fully got back at Lomonosov only after the death of the great Russian scientist. On the very next day after his death, by order of Catherine the Great, the archive of Mikhail Vasilievich was confiscated and disappeared without a trace. It is likely that Mueller still managed to get to the unique archive and simply destroyed it. However, 7 years after Mikhail Vasilievich's death, under Mueller's full control, Lomonosov's work on Russian history was published, which he could not publish during his lifetime.
When you read this work, it becomes completely unclear why Lomonosov fought against German professors for so many years and accused them of falsifying Russian history. In every line, Lomonosov agrees with them on everything.
It turns out that publicly Lomonosov was fighting against German creators of Russian history. But at home, in the quiet of his office, he secretly wrote a version of history that practically coincided with the version of his main opponent, Mueller. The impression is that this work was not written by Lomonosov, but by Mueller. It is not surprising that many researchers of Lomonosov's works doubted the authenticity of this work, but could not substantiate their doubts. However, in the 1970s, a method appeared that allows us to determine whether a literary work belongs to a particular author or not. This method was developed by Soviet scientists Valentina Polikarpovna and Timofey Grigorievich Fomenko.
Valentina Polikarpovna and Timofey Grigorievich Fomenko made an important discovery in linguistics. They found that there is a very interesting author's invariant in the Russian language. That is, a parameter that allows different groups of authors to be distinguished from each other.
To calculate the author's invariant of a specific writer, you need to divide the text of their work into several parts, each of which will contain an equal number of words.
The more words in each part, the more accurate the study will be.
The most accurate result can be obtained if each part contains at least 16,000 words. Therefore, voluminous works, such as War and Peace by Tolstoy, are suitable for such research. But short stories and essays are not. So, by dividing the text of the novel into several equal parts, you need to determine how many function words are contained in each part, that is, prepositions, conjunctions, and particles. The percentage of function words in each part of the work is the author's invariant. Valentina and Timofey Fomenko conducted a unique experiment that had never been done before. They manually calculated the percentage of function words in the works of almost 80 authors who wrote in Russian, without using computers. It turned out that in the works of the same author, the percentage of function words would always be the same. This is what it looks like on a graph, with the horizontal axis representing the number of parts of the text and the vertical axis representing the percentage of function words. Typically, it does not exceed 30%. For example, Leo Tolstoy's author's invariant looks like this, with the percentage of function words in his work being 23.6%. And this is Fyodor Dostoevsky's author's invariant, with the percentage of function words in his works being 25.3%. Anatoly Fomenko and his colleagues Gleb Nosovsky and Nikolai Kelin used this method to determine the author's invariant of Mueller and Lomonosov. Here's what they found. Lomonosov's author's invariant was calculated using his work A Brief History of the Academic Chancellery. Because this text contains more than 16,000 words and its authenticity is beyond doubt.
Mueller's author's invariant was calculated using his work, Information about Russian Nobles.
This work also meets all the necessary requirements for conducting research. It is written in Russian and contains more than 16,000 words.
The following results were obtained.
Lomonosov's author's invariant is 20 to 21%, and Mueller's invariant is 28%. Then, the authors of the new chronology calculated the author's invariant of the ancient Russian history, which historians attribute to Lomonosov. It turned out that the percentage of function words in this work ranges from 24 to 27%.
Based on the previous results obtained from approximately 80 Russian authors and writers, we must state that the text attributed to Lomonosov today, namely his history book, was not written by Lomonosov, but by someone else. The difference in the invariant values of 20 to 21 and 24 to 27 is beyond the acceptable range for fluctuations within the same author's text. This had never happened with other authors examined in the experiment, which numbered in the dozens. This situation is clearly unique, striking, and very suspicious.
Even more remarkable is that the author's invariant of ancient Russian history of 24 and 27% is very close to Mueller's author's invariant, which is 28%. Even if the text of ancient Russian history was originally written by Lomonosov, it is likely that Mueller significantly altered it. Historians can argue that the closeness of Mueller's author's invariant to the invariant of the text of ancient Russian history proves nothing. And indeed, Fomenko and Nosovsky in their works provide several examples when the author's invariants of different authors are very similar, such as the invariants of Tolstoy and Turgenev. However, these writers were never in compromising opponents and never claimed each other's archives. Mueller, as we know, fought against Lomonosov for many years, and his methods of fighting often went beyond scientific discussions.
We can make a fairly confident assumption that today, under the name of Lomonosov, we have not his text, but a certain book that came out of the kitchen of Mueller Schlotzer. This is a distorted version that has been edited, and regrettably, we cannot trust it. Unfortunately, we do not know what Lomonosov actually wrote in his history, since no traces of the original of this history have reached us.
When in the 19th century the Romanovs decided to canonize their version of Russian history, the absence of Lomonosov's manuscript of ancient Russian history turned out to be very convenient. The composition of Russian history, which was started by foreign historians, was completed by the Russian historian Nikolai Karamzin. Until the 19th century, only a small circle of people knew the version of Russian history that is widely accepted today. However, after the publication of Karamzin's work, History of the Russian State in 1826, this version became widely known. Gradually, it was canonized and introduced into the school history curriculum. To this day, this so-called official historical version dominates the pages of all textbooks. This fabrication has been repeatedly instilled in the minds of each new generation for almost 200 years. However, immediately after the publication of Karamzin's history, his work was sharply criticized by all orthodox and patriotically minded people in Russia. For example, among the critics of this work were Metropolitan Filaret and Admiral Alexander Semyonovich Shishkov. Researchers of Karamzin's works noted that he was too consumer-oriented towards the written documents he used in writing his history. He only took those fragments of texts that corresponded to his narrative and categorically rejected anything that contradicted it. And the Russian historian and writer Nikolai Artsibashev proved the unreliability of one of the main documents used by Karamzin. This is the so-called writing of Prince Kurbsky, History of the Grand Prince of Moscow. Therefore, many noted that Karamzin's works are more of a literary work than an impartial historical analysis. And indeed, Karamzin can hardly be considered an impartial historian. The fact is that Karamzin, who was given the title of official historian of the Russian state, hated Russia and despised everything Russian. At the age of 18, he joined the Masons and became a member of the Golden Crown Masonic Lodge. His Russophobia was manifested in relation to old Russian customs and moral principles of the Russian people. In his Letters of a Russian Traveler, Karamzin wrote, "The purely national is nothing next to the all-human. The main thing is to be human beings, not Slavs." For his works on the official Russian history composition, Karamzin was generously rewarded by Nicholas I. He was granted a pension of 50,000 rubles per year. Furthermore, after his death, the same amount was to be paid to his widow, and after her death, to his children, sons until they entered service and daughters until they got married.
It is with these kinds of enormous sums that the Romanovs paid their courtly writer of Russian history.
Karamzin even had two monuments erected in his honor, one in his hometown of Simbirsk, now Ulyanovsk, and the other in the village of Ostaofyevo, where Karamzin wrote his history of the Russian state. It should be noted that both monuments look quite unusual. On the pedestal of the Ulyanovsk monument is featured not the figure of Karamzin, but a statue of the goddess of history, Clio, while the Ostaofyevo monument prominently displays the 7 volumes of the history of the Russian state. It seems that the Romanovs erected monuments not to the historian himself, but to the version of history he wrote on their order. Alexander Dmitrievich Chertkov was a Russian historian and archaeologist who spent many years studying Russian history and Slavic antiquities. One of his first works was a description of Russian coins, for which Chertkov was awarded the full Demidov Prize. However, he refused the prize, directing all the money towards the publication of the Ostromir Gospel. He inherited a large library from his parents, which he constantly supplemented with works on Russia and Slavic culture. In 1838, Chertkov published the first volume of the catalogue of his library, which was called the General Library of Russia, or the Catalogue of Books for Studying Our Homeland in All Respects and Details. 7 years later, the second volume of the catalogue appeared. Before the formation of the Department of Russian History in the Imperial Public Library, Chertkov's library was the only valuable collection of books about Russia and the Slavs in Russia. Chertkov accompanied the description of his catalogue with brief comments. Reading them, one can get an idea of what historians of the 18th and 19th centuries wrote about Russia. For example, one Italian author wrote that Macedonians, Thracians, ancient inhabitants of Illyria, as well as Dacians and Getae were Slavs. That in the 16th century, Novgorod was larger than Rome, and many Roman emperors were of Slavic blood. Can you read something like this in history textbooks today? Chertkov also wrote that more than 25 books, published in Germany from 1575 to 1842, reported that Germany was once inhabited by Slavs. It was they who built Leipzig, Dölitz, Röhlitz, Dresden and some other German cities. Later, all these numerous books and testimonies were removed from circulation as a result of the work of the historians of the Mueller school. Yegor Ivanovich Clausen was a teacher, author of scientific and educational books and textbooks, and a Russian nobleman of German origin. In 1831, he became the curator of the Moscow Practical Academy of Commercial Sciences. He held a doctorate in philosophy and a master's degree in fine arts, and was a state councillor. He translated and published the historical work of Tadeusz Wilański, Description of Monuments explaining Slavic Russian history, accompanied by an extensive preface and commentary. All these materials were included in his book with the lengthy title, New Materials for the Ancient History of Slavs in General and Slavic Rus People Before the Rurik Dynasty, with a light sketch of Russian history before the birth of Christ. In this book, Clausen wrote that numerous facts of ancient Russian history had long been ignored and simply overlooked. However, these facts indicated that traces of Russian culture were distinctly visible in the daily life and culture of all European peoples. Despite being of German descent, Clausen stated that many German historians had dealt with Russian history extremely dishonestly. He considered Baer, Mueller, and Schlotzer among these dishonest historians. Clausen wrote, "They adopted everything characteristic Russian to their own people and even attempted to take away not only the glory but even the people's name of the Slavic Rus people. The name Rus, known from ancient times as Slavic, not only to all Asian peoples but also to the Israelites since their arrival in the Promised Land." And among them, the Rus people stand at the forefront not only of the Romans but also of the ancient Greeks, their ancestors. We know that history should not be a panegyric, but we cannot allow them to turn Russian history into satire. Perhaps, it could not be said any better. Addressing Russian historians such as Karamzin, Dombrovsky, and others, Clausen expressed his bewilderment. Let them, with their hand on their hearts, say why they strive to promote Schlotzer's version and stigmatize the ancient Slavs. Following Clausen, one would like to ask contemporary historians why they still promote the Schlotzer system and why there is no place for the research of Yegor Clausen in history textbooks. Ivan Yegorovich Zabelin was a Russian historian and archaeologist. Since 1837, he served in the palace administration of the Moscow Kremlin, working in the archives of the Armory Chamber and the Moscow Palace Office. Within 2 years, Zabelin realized that he had come across a true treasure. He had in his hands numerous intriguing materials about Moscow, Russia that were unknown to anyone else. All his free time not occupied by his official duties, he devoted to archival research. Zabelin published his first work at the age of 22, and by the time he was 30, he had already authored 40 works. During this period, Zabelin began to have doubts about the reliability of the official version of Russian history written by Karamzin. Later, he recalled being astonished that thousands of documents from the 16th and 17th centuries, kept in the Kremlin storage, were not utilized in Karamzin's multi-volume history. As a mature 40-year-old, Zabelin embarked on a new endeavor: archaeology. Engaging in excavations, he frequently encountered situations where the discoveries contradicted the Schlotzer-Mueller version of history. Over many years of work, Zabelin collected and studied an enormous amount of historical material, which he captivatingly presented in his books such as The History of Russian Life Since Ancient Times, History of the City of Moscow, and The Domestic Life of Russian Tsars. Zabelin published around 250 works, including more than 10 fundamental monographs. He spent many years amassing a vast library, so extensive that it was utilized by students at Moscow University.
Starting from 1885, Zabelin served as the deputy chairman of the State Historical Museum, a position that remained tied to him until the end of his life.
Zabelin's personal archive is stored in the Department of Written Sources of the State Historical Museum, consisting of 1,293 folders of documents. Therefore, today it can be confidently stated that the official version of Russian history was invented no earlier than the 18th century, during the reigns of Peter the Great, Anna Ivanovna, and Elizabeth Petrovna. When crafting this version, only those historical materials were used that aligned with the task set before the historians, to create a Russian history that was favorable to the ruling Romanov dynasty. The written sources that form the basis of official Russian history often do not represent original documents. Some documents were carefully edited, while others were simply falsified. The emergence of these documents dates back to the 17th and 18th centuries. It is evident that this historical version is not only erroneous, but also harmful because a false understanding of history hinders the people from objectively assessing their past and making the right choices for the future. As is known, the history of any state is based on written documents, primarily chronicles. The most ancient Russian chronicle recognized by historians is the Radziwill Chronicle. It is this chronicle that formed the basis of the traditional version of ancient Russian history. However, upon careful examination of this ancient document, it becomes apparent that not only the age of the Radziwill Chronicle but also its significance for Russian history has been exaggerated. You can learn more about this in our next film, Radziwill Chronicle, Calling of the Varangians.